Welcome to our growing community of global seekers, seeking to be educated and delighted at the cutting edge. Hello to people all over the US and from 103 countries who have registered for this series. Thank you all for tuning in. We're offering this new free series in order to build an online global community focused on brain health. We'd like to thank Lugano Diamonds for their generous support as our national underwriter. We thank Lugano Diamonds for choosing Aspen Brain Institute as a nonprofit worthy of their support and their values, and for making our Zoom expert series free to the public and able to be viewed worldwide. We also thank Alpine Bank for their generous support, and thanks to our partners at Brain Futures who are doing important work advancing the practical application of new scientific understanding of the brain and learning. At our Expert Series 2.0, you will hear global leaders, deep thinkers, technology experts, cutting-edge scientists, top-notch doctors, and extraordinary creatives. We hope that their insights will transform how you treat your brain today in a way that your 80-year-old brain will thank you for tomorrow. We at Aspen Brain Institute are on a mission, and our mission is to create a brain-healthy planet. We plan to do this by sharing access to the top minds and evidence-based research on brain health and by increasing brain health literacy worldwide. It is my honor and privilege to bring to you these new episodes. Let's see what we can learn and explore together. I want to now introduce you to our moderator for the next expert speaker. Our moderator is Dr. Ronnie Stangler. Dr. Ronnie Stangler is a physician and psychiatrist. She's also clinical professor at the University of Washington, co-founder of Genome Advisory, and chair of Aspen Brain Institute's Scientific Advisory Council. Ronnie, take it away. Ciao.
Glenda, thank you.
You're welcome.
Extraordinary times. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures, and I would add extraordinary people. And we are going to check all of those boxes by the end of this session. Prevention with 2020 foresight, the science of surviving and thriving beyond the pandemic. It is an honor and a privilege to introduce you to Dr. Preston Estep. The first many times we met was in the cafeteria of Harvard Medical School's new research building on Avenue Louis Pasteur in Boston. It was certainly not the physical environment that encouraged Dr. Estep's generosity. Both his passion for the science of genetics and his deep expertise were immediately apparent. And over time, he has truly become my go-to person when I struggle with a scientific concept. Dr. Estep completed his postdoctoral training in genetics at Harvard University under the tutelage of the greatly esteemed George Church, with whom he has continued to collaborate for many years, including a current project he will discuss later. Dr. Estep serves as advisor to the Personal Genome Project at Harvard Medical School, to Volta Labs, Nebula Genomics, and other leading startup companies in biotech and healthcare. He is co-founder and chief scientific officer at RaDVaC, the Rapid Deployment Vaccine Collaborative for COVID, about which we will hear more in a bit. Today, we are collapsing two separate and very important discussions, so my brief introduction of Dr. Estep will end here. Preston will speak for roughly 15 minutes, during which he will highlight a critical and actionable missing piece of the longevity puzzle. On a very personal note, I consider this a victory lap for a prescient book he authored in 2016, The Mindspan Diet. We will have a brief question period following his discussion, and I will then transition us into a wildly fascinating part 2 of our session about vaccines. This will also be followed by a brief question period. I promise you that we will be surprised and enlightened by Dr. Preston Estep. Dr. Estep.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. I'm going to share my screen here. And while I'm doing that, I just wanted to issue a quick correction. I did my PhD with George Church. I got my doctorate with him. I didn't do a postdoc. I went on to industry. So anyway, all the other stuff is true, I hope. Thank you very much. I'm just going to, okay, can you see my screen okay? I have to, okay.
Yes, everything looks great.
Okay. Okay, so today I'll be presenting on 2 topics of heightened importance for all of us, staying alive and well for the foreseeable future and hopefully far, far beyond. So 2 key concepts to keep in mind throughout are prevention and preparedness. And one of the most important things to keep in mind about prevention right now is that people with pre-existing conditions are faring very poorly in the pandemic. So very good health is important for us, even when we're taken by surprise by things like a pandemic. So I'm going to first start off with trying to advance the slides. There we go. So let's start beyond 2020, hopefully far beyond. I'm sure most of you can't wait to see 2020 in hindsight, but what I'm talking about when I say far beyond is living a very, very long and very healthy life. In 2016, I published a book called The Mindspan Diet. It isn't a typical diet book. It isn't about weight loss or weight maintenance. It's about longevity of both body and mind. And most of the longevity material I'll present is drawn from the Mindspan Diet, but there's much more in the book than I can discuss today. So if you're interested, you can find out much more information and reference materials on proven longevity diets of the world in the Mindspan Diet. So what do I mean by Mindspan? This graphic shows you why I use the term Mindspan for my book, and it highlights the difference between lifespan, which is often used as a measure of good health or long life, and Mindspan. Lifespan isn't the best measure of health because if one spends the last many years of life in progressive and eventually severe cognitive decline, then those final years aren't good years. They should be effectively subtracted from lifespan. Mindspan is lifespan of the high performance mind. It means you fully experience and enjoy your life. So we know from many studies that the majority of longevity is determined by environment and that genes play a much lesser role. Of course, this is great news because we can't yet change our genes, but we can control our longevity by controlling factors in our environment. And we can see the effect of environment here. These are identical twins. They have essentially identical genes, but because of different environmental factors, the one on the left looks older, and chronological age and calendar age is calendar age, and biological age is the equivalent of some typical age. And you can see that they can be very different. And the difference isn't just skin deep. Twins who look older typically die younger. So there are many possible environmental factors that contribute to Mindspan, but many studies over decades tell us that diet is by far the single most important and proven environmental control over longevity of both body and mind. So to maximize Mindspan, the food you put into your body and what you don't put into it is the largest single controllable factor in your longevity. So returning to this graphic comparing lifespan and mindspan, again, mindspan is the lifespan of the high performance mind. It means good overall health and longevity of both body and mind. And I began pinpointing the genetic and dietary determinants of mindspan by comparing countries, regions, individuals who live very long lives with low levels of dementia to those who live fairly long lives, close to as long as those with the longest lives, but with high levels of dementia. I refer to the people in the region circled in red as the Mindspan Elite, and people in the areas circled in black don't live as long and have very high levels of dementia. I call these the Mindspan risk. So the Mindspan Elite not only live several years longer than other people, they have minimal cognitive decline and low dementia, and in effect, they live more than an extra decade of high quality life. So Japanese women lead in virtually every longevity category. Women have greater longevity and mindspan than men worldwide by a few years, but in Japan, about half the difference is due to heavier cigarette smoking by Japanese men, and the difference is even much greater than in most countries. And so if Japanese men didn't smoke as much, the average Japanese person would live far longer than people in other countries. So here's a really important fact about the Mindspan leader, Japan. Into the 1960s, they were actually longevity laggards. This is many developed countries, including most European countries, most large European countries. Until the mid 1950s or so, late 1960s, Japan was way behind these other countries. Then something changed that shot Japan to the top. And while other countries gained about 3 to 4 years over the course of a generation, 3 to 4 years of lifespan, the Japanese gained over a decade. So what was that change that occurred? Well, salt. Through the 1950s, nobody knew the link between salt and high blood pressure, and the sky-high stroke rate in Japan was a mystery. Stroke was the #1 killer in Japan. And then scientists made the link between salt intake and hypertension, and the government launched an aggressive public health campaign, and Japan, in very short order, halved its 11,000 milligram per day sodium consumption, and stroke rate plummeted by over 90%, and Japan rose to the pinnacle of worldwide longevity and mindspan. So this raises a really critical question. Is there a single easily modifiable factor in our diet that similarly undermines our health, perhaps even accelerating how quickly we age? Well, in comparing the Mindspan Elite with the Mindspan Risk, here's one key difference that clearly stands out. Traditional Mindspan Elite diets are historically very low in red meat relative to Mindspan Risk, but the main problem is not saturated fat. The bigger problem is excess iron. The #1 recommendation I make to people who want to achieve longevity of body and especially mind is to keep iron sufficient but low. Iron is necessary for life, but it's the most abundant and powerful pro-oxidant in the body. Increasing amounts above sufficiency provides no extra benefit and increases the risk of many diseases and shortens life. Again, keep iron sufficient but low. And in addition to being a potent pro-oxidant, iron is a potent driver of protein aggregation involved in Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and other degenerative brain diseases. These aggregates consist of iron, bits of these proteins like beta amyloid or alpha-synuclein, and other junk, and these aggregates progressively kill and displace functional brain tissue. And the genes involved in aggregate formation, the ones listed here, beta amyloid, tau, and alpha-synuclein, are all regulated by iron levels. So Mindspan Elite don't eat much red meat, but what do they eat? Well, the base of both the Japanese and Mediterranean diet pyramids are grains, but not the whole grains you always hear about. In Japan, they get more calories from white rice than from any other food. And in the Mediterranean, they get many of their calories from bread and pasta. Bread and pasta from refined wheat. But many of you probably, are thinking, wait a minute, we have the same foods and we're told that they're bad for us. What's going on here? Well, the answer is that the Mindspan Elite refined grain foods look like ours, but they're not like ours. They're not the same, and the key difference is iron. Mindspan risk refined grain products like white rice, pasta, and bread are almost universally enriched with iron, whereas the Mindspan Elite countries have never enriched their staple foods with iron. Now here's a nutrition label from a popular breakfast cereal. This estimated daily value or requirement for iron is way too high for most people. For the amount of calories in a typical diet, this is about 25 times too much iron relative to the amount of food. But that's based on a value of 18 milligrams of iron. And the government's daily value for women over the age of 50 and for all men is 8 milligrams of iron, much less than 18 milligrams than you see on most ingredient labels on foods. So the amount in a single serving of the cereal is actually 225% of the daily value, a 56-fold excess for the amount of calories in this serving. And if we compare this cereal to white rice, the staple of Mindspan leaders of the world, it has over 100 times as much iron per calorie as white rice. So on a personal note, this particular nutrition label is from the cereal my grandmother used to eat at many meals, including not just breakfast, including lunch and dinner, in her later years and throughout her descent into dementia, before I discovered the dangers of excess iron. And so when I started writing the Mindspan Diet and through the publication of it in 2016, I thought the evidence implicating excess iron and accelerated aging was very strong and essentially irrefutable, but it was only this summer that really definitive large-scale evidence finally arrived. And there's a lot of jargon in this title, Multivariate Genomic Scan, implicates novel loci and heme metabolism and human aging. But this is the British, so the heme is the British spelling of the word Heme, which is the molecule that is used to carry iron in the blood, and then that makes blood red. And so here's a friendlier presentation of key information without the jargon. This is one of the news articles that came out the following day after this publication, and here are some of the high points of this study. This is the largest longevity study ever done, over 1 million people. And their conclusion is that too much iron in the blood is linked to an increased risk of dying earlier. And this is a quote from the authors. "We are very excited by these findings as they strongly suggest that high levels of iron in the blood reduce our healthy years of life, and keeping these levels in check could prevent age-related damage." So this strengthens the link between high red meat consumption, high iron, and accelerated aging. So some people tell me that they've made a switch to plant-based meats and they think that this will save them from the ill effects of red meat. And so you can see a comparison here of the Beyond Meat burger and the Impossible burger. All of the key information that you would want, unfortunately, except for iron. And one key fact not presented in this revolution of plant-based meats was that this discovery by Impossible Foods that the magic ingredient in meat that is most responsible for the meaty flavor is none other than iron, specifically heme iron, the form of iron found in blood and in red meat. And here it's on the ingredient label. And adjusting for iron in a way that we did previously for the breakfast cereal, the percentage of daily intake needs to be increased. And so that the amount that you get from a single burger, either a Beyond Meat or Impossible Burger, is 56% of your daily value. So for anyone who isn't a premenopausal woman, this is an extremely high amount of iron. So here are some longevity take-home points that will get you on an evidence-based path to longevity in Mindspan. So first of all, test your iron, including your serum ferritin. You can't guess what you should be eating until you know what your iron levels should be and what they are. So the Mindspan diet gives you lots of information about what each parameter of your iron tests you should shoot for, but always keep sufficient but low iron. You should also keep sufficient but low protein. That's a Mindspan Elite top feature of their diets that I didn't get to talk about much today. But low protein, especially animal protein, is also key for longevity of both body and mind. And both the Japanese and Mediterraneans eat substantial amounts of good carbs, but always watch for iron enrichment of your carbohydrates, your pasta, bread, and white rice and other carbs. They're usually in places like the US, Canada, the UK, and other places in Europe, they are enriched with iron. So always read the nutrition labels. So that concludes the Mindspan and iron part of my presentation. So I'll pause there for some questions.
Thank you, Preston. I was waiting for your screen to disappear. I would emphasize something you didn't say directly, but that enormous and impressive study was not designed specifically to look at the role of iron in longevity. That was an entirely incidental surprise finding, and it blows one's, or at least my, socks off. And I would add that our audience at the Aspen Brain Institute is dedicated and sophisticated, and they have heard many discussions about aging and health spans and longevity, and certainly discussions about Alzheimer's and efforts to prevent or slow its course. And how is it, and I know I am speaking for many here, that most of us know so very little about the critical role of iron?
Yeah, mostly when we hear about iron, we hear about our people's fears of deficiency, and so, like I said, when I wrote Mindspan Diet, I thought the evidence was already strong and and irrefutable, but very few people hear about this. So it's a lot. There's a lot of information that's buried in the biomedical literature. And one of the things that I learned when I read this large-scale study like you did is that the authors approached this with in a hypothesis-neutral way. They weren't looking to make the link between iron, and they were almost surprised, I think, to find that iron was such a strong signal in their data. And I'm continually baffled by this because, there are literally hundreds of very strong publications that implicate iron in accelerated aging. But this study, I think, will get us over the top because it is getting a lot of press. It was in a very prestigious journal. And I think that it takes a while, biomedical practice, from research findings, to frontline medical advice. It takes a long time for information, to percolate upward. But I think that within a few years, we'll all know that iron really is, probably the single most important determinant of accelerated aging. As you and I discussed before, we watched the quiet disappearance of iron from silver formula vitamin and multi-mineral formulations a few years ago. So I think that even the pharmaceutical industry and vitamin manufacturers have gotten the message that excess iron is very dangerous for people's bodies and minds.
Well, that long last mile from the bench in the lab to bedside, it's nice that the vitamin manufacturers knew about this, but I wish the populace did. We got to start selling some t-shirts. This is really critical information. Preston, generally when people talk about nutrition and health and longevity and then focus on diet, the focus on diet tends to reflect a kind of genes or diet dichotomy. And you make the case so clearly for understanding the interdependence of genes and diet. So ideally, one's genetic makeup should inform one's choices in nutrition. So not one right diet for everyone. Could you address briefly what additional information might be gained for individuals by whole genome sequencing, and how might that information guide what we eat and the lives we live?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two really important genes and classes of genes involved in iron metabolism and iron distribution throughout the body. One is called ApoE. ApoE is involved in the transport of iron into the central nervous system and into the brain. This is something that a lot of people, not even scientists, know about the function of ApoE, but a lot of people do know that this one particular variant, ApoE E4, is really a troubling finding in somebody's genetics. But one of the factors that we now know about ApoE and so let me just add the other class of genes is one's related to hemochromatosis, the HFE gene and related variants. The really important point about ApoE and about HFE is that those are the two most common pathogenic or harmful variants that are found in the population. Yeah. So a quarter of the population carries a harmful variant in ApoE, either one or two copies of ApoE E4. A quarter of the population carries harmful variants in HFE that cause excess iron accumulation from the diet. So it's really important. I mean, these are not rare variants. Half the population carries some harmful variant and runs an elevated risk that is very relevant to how much iron they have in their body. So it's critically important for people to know what their genes, what their genetic background is, and to know what their iron levels are, to know what those interactions might be, to protect themselves maximally against the damage that can be done by excess iron.
Okay, so with great difficulty, only because there's so much more to explore here, Preston, a transition to part two, vaccines. So we know that the greatest risk factors for serious COVID infection, pre-existing health condition and older age, underscore the critical importance of preventative health. So now that we've straightened out our iron levels to afford us longer, healthier lives and gain, at least on a hypothetical level, some protection from COVID infection, on the more immediate horizon are matters relating to vaccines. And I am deliberately using the plural here. Dr. Estep, will you now explain your rationale behind the establishment of RaDVaC, the Rapid deployment vaccine collaborative and its creation of the first ever open source COVID vaccine formulation.
Yes, I'm happy to. Thank you, Ronnie. One note before we go, before we leave iron, is that infections actually are exacerbated tremendously by high iron.
Yes.
So one of the things, including viral and bacterial infections. So it's important to get your iron levels under control as soon as possible, especially in a situation like we're in right now. So I'm going to share my screen. Start talking, address the next topic here. All right. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so let's transition on to staying alive and well now and for the foreseeable future, and focus on the testing and vaccines for SARS-CoV-2. So we can take many protective measures today, but all credible experts say that good testing and vaccines will be the factors that bring the pandemic to an end. And we need to start now to create preventive measures against the next pandemic so it doesn't happen in the same way that this one is happening. So as the pandemic began to unfold in early March, I began to research testing and vaccines, but I saw that essentially everyone, all companies and people I knew, were piling into two general groups: those who wanted to produce tests for immediate deployment, and those who wanted to and intended to produce vaccines, but for deployment in 2021 at population scale. So I wanted the best of both worlds. I thought it was possible to produce vaccines for near-term deployment. So I reached out to some of my colleagues, and on March 9th, I sent them an email and asked my colleagues if they knew of anyone working on their own private or DIY vaccines, do-it-yourself vaccines. Nobody they knew of was doing that. So we decided to develop vaccines that we would test on ourselves and then release all vaccine information publicly. We formed the Rapid Deployment Vaccine Collaborative less than 3 weeks after the formation, after I emailed colleagues. I took the first generation of RaDVaC vaccine. And a few weeks later, my colleagues, some of whom are shown here on this slide, they joined and took generation 2. And we recently designed generation 9, and now over 50 people have taken the vaccine. Here's a New York Times article from last month describing RaDVaC, complete with an unflattering photo of me in the lab snorting the vaccine I just made together with the RaDVaC team. And several factors allowed us to move very quickly to make and take vaccine ourselves. But one overriding factor in our decision was that we knew, even in March, that the virus was extremely deadly and that we could very likely make a vaccine that would very probably carry far lower risks than the virus. So we saw the unfolding pandemic as a clear real-world demonstration of the trolley problem, which is a thought experiment proposed in the 1960s by the philosopher Philip Foot. And this is the problem. A runaway trolley is heading down a track where 5 people are standing. You're standing next to a switch to change the tracks. If you don't switch the tracks, the trolley will probably hit and kill all 5 people. But then you notice that there's one person standing on the adjacent track, and if you switch tracks, then your action will probably cause the trolley to hit and kill that person. Your inaction is likely to do far more harm than your action, but if you take action, you will have to take direct responsibility for whatever harm is done. So what do you do? So the vaccine trolley problem is even more complicated. The trolley is the virus, and it's already hitting people. Thousands of people every day around the world. Over 1,000 dying every day, nearly 1,000 dying every day in the US on certain days. So vaccines aren't yet widely available. And there isn't one person at the switch. There's a diffuse lack of direct control, including regulatory bodies like the FDA, vaccine companies, public opinion, politicians, and so on, all standing around this control to switch tracks and discussing whether or not to turn on, change the tracks and turn on the vaccines. So the result is that the virus runs unchecked, and massively more people are being killed by the virus than would be harmed by vaccines, we believe. So what's the difference in harm done, including deaths, irreversibly damaged physical and mental health, economic ruin for many? Is the difference 100-fold or maybe 1,000-fold? Only future retrospective analyses will give us some general idea of the range, but I predict that all or nearly all vaccines that adhere to modern design principles will be vastly safer than infection by SARS-CoV-2. And so part of what we accomplished with RaDVaC, if you look over here on the right-hand side of the screen, we've moved the control. So part of what we've accomplished with RaDVaC was to take control and risk ourselves. You know, we don't have sufficient control over the risks that are still posed to everyone. But hopefully our small scale demonstration has a larger impact and allows greater expanded volunteer trialing of future experimental vaccines. And since our vaccine recipe is simple and open source, people can decide today to do this for themselves. So again, going back to this, wonderful New York Times picture, I just want to use this to highlight that the vaccine that we chose is a nasal vaccine. And I'm going to skip most of this, but nasal vaccination efficiently stimulates mucosal immunity. And that's really important, and it's different from the kind of the immunity that you get with an injectable vaccine. So nasal vaccines are preferable for respiratory viruses like SARS-CoV-2 to prevent infection at points of entry into the body, like the nose or the lungs. And so soon after the New York Times began following us for the story that they eventually published on us, there was a story in the New York Times about how you'd rather get a coronavirus vaccine through your nose because of this protection, this complete protection from viral infection, rather than the incomplete protection that you get from systemic immunity triggered by injectable vaccines. So this technology review article presents a very sensationalist perspective, but this is me and together with George Church taking a selfie of himself administering the vaccine. But the headline does bring up an important point. How do we know if a vaccine works? Does it provide protection against infection? And this is a very difficult question, not just for the RaDVaC vaccine, but for any vaccine. Clinical trials proceed through various phases, starting with preliminary studies, and eventually yield data on very large numbers of people, and ultimately show that the fraction of people who receive the vaccine are protected relative to either placebo or relative to people who did not or who did not participate. And those two kinds of trials are either placebo-controlled trials or challenge trials in which people who have taken the vaccine are administered a dose of the virus to intentionally challenge them with an infection. But after clinical trials and during population deployment, when these vaccines are given to the average people, given to us, there's typically no testing done. So we don't know whether or not we've established a protective immune response. We know that maybe in clinical trials, 60% or 70 or 75% of people who got the vaccine were protected. But when we actually receive the vaccine, we don't know whether or not we're protected. And so what should we do? What do we need for this pandemic and for better preparedness for next time? Well, first of all, we need a rapid response vaccine infrastructure. We need these first 2 points are how to sort of construct that rapid response vaccine infrastructure. We need a proven vehicle, well tested in clinical trials. And within 3 to 4 months, we need a mature vaccine design. And this third point is really, really important, I think. We need a large-scale volunteer trialing, millions of people who are willing to trial experimental vaccines, not just a few thousand, tens of thousands of people. People who are willing to take experimental vaccines should be given the right to choose for themselves, given the autonomy, the kind of autonomy that we're exercising in RaDVaC, to try these experimental vaccines. The other thing that we need for rapid response is a more mature testing infrastructure, not just testing for current infection or prior infection like we've seen in the deployment of the kind of testing for SARS-CoV-2, but confirmatory testing of vaccinated people to show whether or not they've raised a protective immune response. Because this is really critically important to actually protect people. People should not receive a vaccination and just hope they're in the group that is protected against infection. So those are the 2 key points, I think, that you see that I advocate that are very different than the points that you'll find on the list of other people advocating for preparedness for the next pandemic. And so I think if you went back a year and if you thought about, if somebody had predicted to you that a year from that point, we would be undergoing a pandemic that would have cost over a million people's lives worldwide, with tens of millions of people having suffered possibly irreversible damage to their health and trillions of dollars in damage, you probably wouldn't have believed it. So we need to get into a position with these other technologies where we get ahead of the next pandemic to save this number of lives, this cost to people's health and to our economies around the world, so that this doesn't happen again. So thank you very much. Stay safe, and I'm happy to answer any questions. If you don't get your question answered this time, feel free to reach out by email, and happy to connect on anything that you might want to ask.
Preston, it's again, this is extraordinary. You are extraordinary. So I think you've answered the question that many physicians are often asked. I personally went to a pharmacy a few weeks ago and got an influenza injection vaccination. How do I know whether it will protect me from influenza? I want you to say it again.
You don't. You don't know.
What's the bar of efficacy?
Well, right now, so for the past few years, influenza vaccines have been about 50% effective or less. And so you almost might as well flip a coin. But if you're over 60, the odds are much lower. If you're over 70, even lower. And of course, these are people who need the protection most. So we need to get not just good vaccines, with higher effectiveness levels, but we need to know whether or not these vaccines work in us personally. You know, we hear a lot about precision medicine, about personalized medicine. One of the most important aspects of personalized precision medicine is knowing whether or not a therapy is actually working in us. It's, you know, so for example, we know when we go and have our annual physical, not that many of us have done that in the last several months, but we get a cholesterol test. We know whether or not, you know, our cholesterol is extremely high. And if it is, we get a statin prescribed. And the next time we go to our doctor, if cholesterol is still high, then maybe they up the dose. And if it's very, very low, maybe they take us off the statin. This is closing the loop between a diagnostic or prognostic and a therapeutic. And we need this especially for extremely serious and deadly diseases, you know, like COVID-19.
This morning, there was an announcement from the United Kingdom that volunteers will be first injected with an experimental COVID vaccine and then subsequently exposed to the coronavirus. And that is clearly one way to test efficacy. You have emphasized the importance of the immunity confirmatory test. How long would you predict before that test will be available for COVID?
Unfortunately, you know, I've talked to many scientists and people in the business. Nobody's even thought of doing this. This is you know, uncharted territory. So I've talked to some colleagues about launching a research effort to do this and potentially a company. But this is early days. Nobody's even contemplating the development of this because it adds to the cost, it adds to the complications, right? You know, say your initial test is negative. Well, that adds to additional vaccine costs, not just the cost of the test, right? So people in the biomedical business and healthcare, you know, they see this as a massive expenditure. But I see the massive expenditures that are happening now in the pandemic, you know, in the trillions of dollars, as actually being the massive expenditures, and the preventive measures as actually being very cost effective. So there's going to be an initial resistance to these kinds of confirmatory tests, but I think in the long run they'll save lives, save health, and save money.
Well, let me interject what people may not be aware of, and that is that the FDA, in its Operation Warp Speed initiative, subsidized by federal funds to the tune of well over $10 billion against COVID, the efficacy bar there too has been set at 50%. Nodding is all that I expected you to do, but again,
I think that that's, you know, for emergency use, right? I
yes.
mean, so basically, you know, I think that they've just set a very low bar to try to allow some vaccines into the market. I think that that's a reasonable thing to do. I think we need any vaccines, even you know, half-baked vaccines. And I think that even, you know, relatively immature vaccines are going to be far better than exposure to the virus. So I think it's reasonable for the FDA to set a low bar.
What there are different low bars. We're obviously all concerned about, in addition to efficacy, safety. What are the safety concerns for your peptide nasal vaccine?
Well, so we've, you know, there's a continuum of safety. You know, there's short-term safety, and like I said, over 50 people have taken the vaccine now, taken multiple doses of the vaccine. So We've had only a few very mild headaches, lots of nasal congestion. So very mild side effects demonstrating short-term safety. Long-term safety is really much more complicated. And you really can't fully test any vaccine in a clinical trial. You cannot get a complete measure of the long-term safety of a vaccine. So there's lots of important design principles that vaccine scientists and manufacturers have to incorporate into a vaccine to prevent certain kinds of dangers that have accompanied vaccinations in the past with less, and this is generally a long time ago, starting in the 1960s with a vaccine for respiratory syncytial virus. But even fairly recently, there was a vaccine for dengue fever, Dengvaxia, that has caused what's called vaccine-enhanced disease. But even in cases where there's vaccine-enhanced disease, the features of the vaccines that triggered those negative consequences are at least somewhat understood. And so they've become part of a set of guidelines that vaccine manufacturers and scientists use, to avoid certain design features in vaccines that might trigger those same kinds of reactions. We still can't guarantee complete long-term safety, but I think, as I said before, I predict that either all or the vast majority of vaccines that are coming out with these more mature designs will be far safer than exposure to SARS-CoV-2.
Preston, could you briefly share with us the thinking on a very big level, the differences amongst the primary contenders for the first to be released vaccines?
Well, I'll say this, because of the regulatory process that has to take place, that is really, the aspects of the clinical trialing process that have not been pandemic responsive. All of the first vaccines that will cross the finish line into population scale deployment, all those designs had to be locked in place very early in the pandemic before we learned a huge amount that we now know about the virus and about clinical responses, to the virus. So I understand why the vaccines needed to be locked in place, but the simple fact, I'm not blaming the scientists or the companies or anyone involved. I'm just saying that those first vaccines that are available are not the best vaccines. They're not the most mature vaccines, but they're still probably much better than exposure to SARS-CoV-2.
You had mentioned that you were on the 9th iteration of the RaDVaC vaccine, and that you add additional peptides as more information is available, unlike the large pharma who have to very slowly steer the ship. Do you anticipate continuing to upgrade your formula?
It's certainly an open question. I think, and I predict we'll probably make some adjustment, but I think generation 9, even generation 7 and 8 were quite mature. Generation 9 incorporates a huge amount of information on the clinical responses to certain parts of the virus. So we know now which little tiny bits of the virus trigger the strongest immune response, and not just antibody responses. A lot of people focus, on antibody responses. They're the most easily tested part of an immune response, but it's becoming clear that there's another aspect or multi-layered complexity to the immune response that is at least as important as the antibody response. And so the T cell response is actually what's responsible for clearing the virus from an infected person's body. without a robust T cell response, people have extremely serious cases of COVID-19. So a lot of the information we now know that we have has been incorporated into generation 7, 8, and 9 of the RaDVaC vaccine. That information wasn't available in March, April, May, June, when a lot of the designs were being locked into place for commercial vaccines. So we think that with this information about about the T cell response and the immune response that's necessary for clearing the virus from your body, that enables the design of much more sophisticated and effective vaccines.
So what you're saying suggests that there may even be complementary vaccines. At this point, would you hazard a guess as to whether you, Preston, will take an additional fully clinically tested vaccine when it or they become available? Or is the answer that's complicated and that depends?
The answer is complicated and it depends, but I am absolutely open to taking a good, well-designed, well-vetted commercial vaccine.
With apologies, Dr. Estep, both to you and to our beloved audience. As I mentioned right at the outset, our session time was so brief relative to the richness and the importance of what we were hoping to discuss. I know the audience has many more comments and questions, and I would encourage you to be in touch with Dr. Estep and the ABI, who will then be in touch with Dr. Estep. I also know that our discussion with you, Preston, might be entirely different a month from now, and that truly is the nature of cutting-edge science and cutting-edge scientists. But we are exceedingly grateful to you for sharing these precious moments. And I personally am especially grateful to you for sharing with us what truly is a universal dilemma. In some ways, this pandemic represents the perfect storm of unprepared public health systems, gross health disparities, inadequately treated chronic medical illness, as well as global warming, toxic pollution of the air we breathe. Preston, you and your colleagues have courageously, and I appreciate some suggest outrageously, assumed positions of active responsibility rather than remaining passive observers of truly existential threats. And I raise the question broadly to our group, what responsibilities do we all have as both citizen scientists, but more broadly as an informed citizenry of compassion and of hope? For us to ponder, Preston, please come back and visit us again. Glenda?
Okay.
Back to you.
You too. Way to go. This is really beautiful and exciting. And I think we needed to hear this. And we really never knew about the courageous folks at RaDVaC and others, I imagine, who are really taking this on themselves as their responsibility to help us find a way forward with COVID-19. So thank you, Preston, for your generous expression of all the news and ethical items that you bring to us. Thank you so much for your discussion. And Ronnie, thank you for great, intelligent moderation. Thank you so much. Preston, I eventually have a question for you. I'll write it to you personally, but it was very quickly. How would someone talk to themselves an individual, about a layperson, why they would take part in a clinical trial or in a do-it-yourself clinical trial, which you feel needs to be in the millions of people. And if we could talk separately or respond later to the public, how would you talk to yourself about convincing yourself to do that? I'd love to hear that.
We've had a lot of those discussions. Happy to have another.
Okay.
Thank you so much for hosting me. It's been
This was brilliant. Thank you. And thanks to the audience for getting educated and sophisticated and updated on the science of brain health and vaccines. Thank you again to our sponsors, Lugano Diamonds and Alpine Bank. And I want to remind everyone that this session was pre-recorded or was recorded and will be available on our website, www.aspenbraininstitute.org, in just a few days. Please check our websites to sign up for the next episode. You can also sign up for the whole series if you'd like. Thanks, everybody, and ciao. See you next time.